The House will come to order. The Pledge of Allegiance this morning will be led by Christian Andrew Aldridge and Connor William Aldridge from homeschoolers from Carbondale.
Please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Scola, please take the roll.
Representatives Becker, Buck, Buckner, Conti. Representative Conti.
Absent.
Absent. Quorum. Court. Representative Court.
Absent.
Del Grosso.
Absent.
Dorr. Duran. Everett.
Absent.
Exum. Fields. Present. Fisher. Foote. Garcia. Gardner.
Absent.
Giroux. Janal. Hamner. Holbert. Hollinghorse. Humphrey. Joshi. Kagan. Representative Court is present. Representative Conti is present. Representative Kagan. Kraftharp. Labuda. Landgraf. Lawrence. Lebsock. Lee. May. McCann. McLaughlin. McNulty. Representative Gardner is present. McNulty?
Absent.
McNulty absent. Melton. Mitch Bush. Moreno. Representative Del Grosso is present. Murray. Navarro. Nordberg. Representative McNulty is present. Pabon. Representative Pabon.
Absent.
Peniston. Pedersen.
You got a second?
Yeah.
I'm here.
Oh, okay, thanks. Primavera. Priola. Rankin. Rosenthal. Representative Rosenthal.
Absent.
Absent. Ryden. Sane. Salazar. Schaefer. Scott. Singer. Sonnenberg.
I have one.
Representative Sonnenberg.
Absent.
Absent. Stevens. Representative Stevens.
Absent.
Absent. Swam. Zabo. Tyler. Vigil. Representative Vigil.
Absent.
Absent. Representative Pabon is present. Oh, Representative Vigil is present. Waller. Williams. Wilson. Wright. Young. Speaker Farandino.
Morning, Corey.
Well, we've got Rosenthal, Everett, and Stevens. Rosenthal, Everett, and Stevens are absent. So 60, no. 62 and 3? Yes, 0 and 3.
Where's Salazar?
Representative Salazar.
We're 62 members present, 3 absent. A quorum is present. Representative Salazar for the Journal. You'll be doing it all week, so.
Oh, okay.
Representative Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that reading of the Journal of March 14th of 2014 be dispensed with and that it be approved as corrected by the Chief Clerk.
You've heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. He's got the luck of the Irish. The motion is adopted. Announcements, introductions. Representative Peniston for, okay, we'll start with Ryden. Representative Ryden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee, please listen up. We are laying over House Bill 1303 today, so there will be no meeting of our committee. Thank you.
Representative Peniston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And would the Capitol Choir please come down and join me? We have 3 birthdays. They're triplets. They all have birthdays on the same day, which was yesterday, the 16th. That would be Representative Fisher, Representative Landgraf, and Representative Hamner. So because we don't have Representative Hamner, we need a lot more people down here with the Capitol Choir. Come on.
How are we going to go?
You know who you are.
Fisher, Landgraf, and Fisher,
Landgraf, and Hamner.
Or say it that way. Okay. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Representative Fisher and Landgraf and Hamner. Happy birthday to you.
Further announcements and introductions. For the presentation of the Green Jacket, Representative Peniston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, everyone. As it is St. Patrick's Day, it is the appropriate day to sort of a bittersweet day for me, having to relinquish this absolutely.
Hold on one sec, Representative Peniston. Members, can we have your attention at the well for the traditional handing off of the Green Jacket?
Sort of a bittersweet day for me because I do have to get rid of this excellent, stylish, and quite expensive, highly refined green jacket. But because it is St. Patrick's Day in the year before I leave this body, it is my distinct pleasure to be able to do that. Now, some have questioned the fact of leaving this to a game of chance because sometimes the jacket has been awarded for meritorious behavior by the opposite party. I mean, there's lots of reasons different people have how they've decided to make the choice. But I thought it was totally appropriate because this green jacket was won originally in a game of chance, in a poker game between Representative Stan Johnson, Republican from Boulder, and Representative Jim Dyer, a Democrat from Durango. So I think it's perfectly appropriate that I left this up to a game of chance. And as you recall, I went to all the different legislators on the opposite side of the aisle that were going to be here next year. I couldn't give it to anybody that was term limited, and they all made their guesses, and it went all the way from 0, and you know who you are, Representative Giroux. She indicated that it was a figment of our imagination. It was really a hologram, so it was really 0, as I recall. And then it went all the way up to 4,700, so there was quite a range. But here I'm going to use a limerick to announce who won. And this person was only 68 chocolate balls off of the total. The total was 2,258 chocolate balls. And this person guessed 2,326, only 68 off. That's amazing. So here's my limerick for today. There once was a legislator named Polly who learned her math skills. Is she here? I hope, oh, there she is. Who learned her math skills in construction, by golly. She calculated each chocolate ball. Within 68 of the exact number did she fall, which earned her the House Green Jacket Folly. Congratulations, Representative Lawrence. You need to come down here and receive this fine, fine gift. Oh, it's going to match my complexion. And you get the chocolate balls. And she gets the book of the history of the Green Jacket. Do you have any words for us,
Representative Lawrence?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, apparently all those years of construction estimating have really paid off for me today. So if anybody needs some chocolate balls, they'll be at my desk. Thank you.
Congratulations, Representative Lawrence. Further announcements and introductions. Representative McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Thursday, members, the Claw Caucus will be meeting again at noon down in room 112 in the basement. You'll have these yellow flyers on your desk. We're going to be hearing about the issue of declawing and some other issues that will come up. So lunch will be provided. There's an RSVP. Please plan to attend on Thursday. Thank you.
Representative Priola.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to introduce a former member of the legislature. Over on this side, we have Paul Schauer, former Representative Paul Schauer. If we could all give him a nice, warm welcome.
Representative Primavera.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For members of the Public Health and Human Services Committee that will meet tomorrow, we will add Senate Bill 18 to our calendar.
Representative Pedersen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, if you could help me in welcoming the third graders from the Colorado Academy up there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Representative Priola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Also, there will be a Colorado Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association networking event tomorrow evening, March 18th, 5:30 to 7:30 at the Denver Press Club. Hope you can make it.
Representative Kraft-Tharp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members, please help me welcome members from STRIDE, a program that helps self-sufficiency and homeless programming. Thank you.
Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And for this next announcement, could we have all of the alums and friends of the University of Colorado join us down here, please? Try to hurry so we can move forward with it. So I think that all of you know that this is CU Day at the legislature, so we have a lot of wonderful alums here visiting with us today, and we are now, Lois, stay here, and we honor them for all that they have done for the university and for the state of Colorado, and all of you that are standing here. So we thought we would, in order to do that, we'd do a little song here. And Joe, you were really good at starting us the last, no, but we could fight to see you down there. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. Fight, see you down the field.
See you must win. Fight, fight for victory. See you knows no defeat, so roll up that mighty score. Never give in. Shoulder to shoulder, we will fight, 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 fight.
I think CU needs a little work on their music department.
More money for CU's music department.
Do they even have a music department? Madam Majority Leader, do you have anything else?
Well, let me just say.
Okay, Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe he's here in the chambers yet, and we're going to have to move forward with our business. He is in the Senate, and the president of the University of Colorado, Bruce Benson, was awarded a tribute today from both the Senate and the House for all of his great leadership in the state of Colorado, and particularly what he's done for the University of Colorado. He is the longest serving University of Colorado president in more than 50 years. So he's done great work. And when you see him, he may be over in a little while, please thank him for all of his work, and we will be giving him a tribute when he gets here.
I see he respects the Senate more than the House. Representative Giroux.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, members, he does not respect the Senate more than the House. He's a bicameral kind of president, and he has served 6 years, which is longer than anybody else. I think Hank Brown served for 3 years, and when Hank found out that President Benson was serving for 6, Hank said, I don't know how he did it. It's a very hard job. Just so you all know, the Anschutz Medical Campus, which is a huge part of the CU system, has a larger economic impact than all of the Colorado ski industries. So what he's doing is incredible. What they're doing is incredible. They've grown the school. They've grown all of us. They've grown our economy. And from this side of the aisle, I'd just like to really thank all of the CU visitors and our regents and our president for being here.
Okay, we'll proceed to our next order of business, third reading of bills, final passage. Members, please return to your desks. Mr. Kohler, please read the title of the House Bill 1285.
House Bill 1285, Representative Ryan Nelson Aguilar, concerning requirement that the professional tax preparer provide certain disclosures to the client when preparing tax documents for the client.
Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the adoption of House Bill 1285 on third reading and final passage.
Seeing no discussion, the question for the House is the passage of House Bill 1285 on third reading and final passage. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine and members proceed to vote. Representatives Melton, Priola, and Stevens. Close the machine. With 36 aye votes, 29 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, House Bill 1285 is passed. Co-sponsors. Close the machine. Mr. Kohler, please read the title to Senate Bill 102.
Senate Bill 102 by Senator Yieldbury, also Representatives Gardner and Rosenthal, concerning the addition of employment positions held at financial institutions to the circumstances under which an employer may use consumer credit information for employment purposes.
Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the adoption of Senate Bill 102 on third reading and final passage.
Seeing no discussion, the question for the House is the passage of Senate Bill 102 on third reading and final passage. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine and members proceed to vote. Representatives Lawrence, close the machine. With 60 aye votes, 5 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, Senate Bill 102 is passed. Co-sponsors. Close the machine. Mr. Kohler, please read the title of Senate Bill 137.
Senate Bill 137 by Senator John, also Representative McNulty, concerning certification of workers' compensation insurance forms.
Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the adoption of Senate Bill 137 on third reading and final passage.
Seeing no discussion, the question for the House is the passage of Senate Bill 137 on third reading and final passage. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine and members proceed to vote. Representatives Fisher. Close the machine. With 65 aye votes, 0 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, Senate Bill 137 is passed. Co-sponsors. Close the machine. Mr. Kohler, please read the title to House Bill 1290.
House Bill 1290, Representative Beckrell, Senator Roberts, concerning addition to the definition of other outlet to enable the operation of a remotely located telepharmacy outlet.
Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the adoption of House Bill 1290 on third reading and final passage.
For the motion, seeing no discussion, the question for the House is the passage of House Bill 1290 on third reading and final passage. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine and members proceed to vote. Representative Pabon. Close the machine. With 65 aye votes, 0 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, House Bill 1290 is passed. Co-sponsors. Close the machine. Mr. Kohler, please read the title to Senate Bill 89.
Senate Bill 89 by Senator Schwartz, also Representative Fisher, concerning a prohibition for the state to enter into an agreement for payment in lieu of taxes.
Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the adoption of Senate Bill 89 on third reading and final passage.
Representative Corum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to talk a moment about unintended consequences. Senate Bill 89 says that it prohibits state agencies from paying taxes, property taxes, in lieu of taxes. That sounds minor until you think about small rural counties where the state of Colorado has made acquisitions of large parcels of land. I just talked to my friends in Ouray County, Representative McLaughlin's district. Right now they're getting 95 cents an acre off of those lands that what Colorado Parks and Wildlife Service owns. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that that's taking money out of the schools, well, you might say, well, we're backfilling that from the General Assembly. What we're not backfilling is the funds that go to Road and Bridge, library, fire districts, cemeteries, a whole list of things that we are affected by this legislation. And we're doing this to communities that their unemployment rate is probably 25 to 30 to 50% higher than the state average. Members, think about what you're doing to these small rural communities, which happens to be in beautiful areas, but jobs are few and far between. And what we're doing, we're putting this on top of the local taxpayers that's staying there, working, trying to survive. And I ask that you vote no on this bill.
Representative Giroux.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were several members on my side of the aisle that voted against this bill in committee, and I want to let you all know why I'm going to be voting for it. This bill came about because of an issue in the Capital Development Committee, which came about because of a bill that we passed last year. And that bill that we passed last year allowed the Department of Ag to buy a building for itself and consolidate where they were going to be housing the Ag Department. And I think the building is up in Interlaken, someplace up there, and you might say, why would the Department of Ag go up to Interlaken? And I can't answer that question, but I know we passed the bill, and rather than micromanage the Department of Ag, I'm going forward with this. There was an issue in the final sale of the building that it was going to require the state of Colorado to pay property taxes. That's something that we don't do, and you can either agree or disagree with that. And I certainly respect those that are disagreeing with it. I'm voting for the bill because, quite honestly, I would rather us put our dollars back to the county in areas that we as a body are controlling more. Now, I'm very much a local control person, normally, but in this instance, I understand why we ran the bill. It's not a bill that would run if that building had not been purchased. It would not have been run if we had not all voted, or those of us that did vote, to allow the Department of Ag to buy a new building. This is one of those circumstances bills. I respect why those of you that will be a no will be a no. I just hope you will understand why I'm a yes.
Representative Fisher. Seeing no further discussion, question for the House, the passage of Senate Bill 89 on third reading and final passage. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine, and members proceed to vote. Representatives Hamner, Mitch Bush, Tyler, Rosenthal, and Young. Close the machine. With 36 aye votes, 29 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, Senate Bill 89 is passed. Co-sponsors. Close the machine. Representative Szabo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask to be removed as a co-sponsor.
Representative Szabo will be removed as a co-sponsor of Senate Bill 89. Mr. Cole, will please read the title of the House Bill 1299.
House Bill 1299 by Representative Tyler, also Senator Todd, concerning the repeal of the 6-year limitation on applying a salvage brand new motor vehicle whose cost of being repaired exceeds the value of the vehicle without the recent damage.
Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the adoption of House Bill 1299 on third reading and final passage.
Seeing no discussion, the question for the House is the passage of House Bill 1299 on third reading and final passage. Mr. Cole, please open the machine and members proceed to vote. Representatives Conti. Close the machine. With 43 aye votes, 22 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, House Bill 1299 is passed. Co-sponsors. Close the machine. Proceed to our next order of business, general orders, second reading of bills. Representative Salazar.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House now resolve into the committee of the whole for consideration of general orders.
You've heard the motion. Seeing no objection, the House will resolve itself in the committee of the whole for consideration of general orders. Representative Salazar will take the chair.
The committee will come to order. With your unanimous consent, the bills will be read by title unless there is a request for reading a bill at length. Committee amendments will not be read unless requested, as they are printed and in your bill folders. Floor amendments will be shown on the screen and on your iPads and not read unless requested. Bills will be laid over upon motion of the Majority Leader. The Cope rule is relaxed. Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to lay over House Bill 1253, Senate Bill 62, and Senate Bill 103 in that order to the end of the calendar.
Are there any objections? Seeing none, the bills will be laid over as requested by the Majority Leader. Madam Majority Leader.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. One more thing. I move to lay over House Bill 1282 to the end of the calendar.
Are there any objections? Seeing none, House Bill 1282 will be laid over as requested by the Majority Leader. What's that? Is it 1267? Okay. Yeah, if you don't mind. Mr. Kohler, please read the title of House Bill 1267.
House Bill 1267, Representative Fisher, all Senator Jones, concerning authorization for political subdivision of the state to release black-footed ferrets on its land.
Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move House Bill 1267 and the report from the Committee on Agriculture, Livestock, and Natural Resources.
Thank you. To the Agricultural, Livestock, and Natural Resources Committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, what we did in the Ag Committee was to put a legislative declaration on the bill that talks about the legislative intent of this bill, and to affirm that land lease for livestock grazing will continue to be managed to maintain and enhance the value of the land for livestock grazing and other agricultural uses, that it's intended that the reintroduction of black-footed ferrets is intended to be carried out in a manner that's sensitive to ongoing livestock grazing, that the prairie dog populations into which the black-footed ferrets would be introduced would be controlled to limit the spread, especially onto adjoining landowners' properties, to affirm that there's no reintroductions can be done without a safe harbor agreement in place by land owned by the political subdivision of the state or adjacent landowners, and that there be adequate stakeholder process involved in this, and that there be education and outreach components incorporated into any reintroduction.
Representative Fisher.
And Mr. Chairman, I have one further addition to this, that I move L006 and ask that it be displayed.
We have L006. This amendment is properly before us and displayed. Please proceed, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. L006 is a further paragraph to go into the legislative declaration, and this was a concern that was brought up by Representative Sonnenberg, and I will acknowledge that Representative Sonnenberg wanted this language to go into the statute, and I had the proponents of the bill take a look at the language that would be going in statute, and they were a little bit uncomfortable with the kind of the imprecise nature of the language, and so I felt that this language was better put into the legislative declaration, which is in the committee report from the Agriculture, Livestock, and Natural Resources Committee. So I ask for a yes vote on this amendment to the committee report.
Is there any further discussion on? Yes, Representative Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I move substitute motion L007 and ask for it to be displayed.
Substitute Amendment L007 is properly before us and displayed. Representative Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And members, we had discussion in Ag Committee about making sure that oil and gas and water infrastructure isn't inhibited by the reintroduction of the black-footed ferret. They had said that wasn't the intent. Representative Fisher wanted to put it in the legislative declaration. What I would like to do, and what I think is appropriate to do, is make sure it's in statute so there's no question that what the intent of the bill is to introduce the black-footed ferret and not inhibit any type of water project or oil and gas. So I would ask a yes vote on L007.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I appreciate Representative Sonnenberg's concerns, and I want to work with him on this. But I really believe that, number one, it was pointed out to me by the proponents of the bill that the rules governing oil and gas development in areas where we have sensitive wildlife species is already in place and capable of making sure that issues around those would be taken into account. So the city of Fort Collins, for example, is not planning to go above and beyond what is already in rule at the COGCC. And then most importantly, I think, is that the safe harbor agreements that would be required to do anything with the reintroduction of black-footed ferrets on these non-federal, non-state public lands would really take care of all of the issues around access to minerals, access to water development projects, and that kind of thing. And so I think this is unnecessary to put in statute, and I always like to err on the side of keeping our statute books simpler rather than more complicated, and so that's why I would prefer a no vote on the substitute amendment.
Representative Dorr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Fisher, I agree with you. There are rules out there.
Hold on just a minute, Representative Dorr. It's getting a little loud in here. Please pay attention to the well or take your side conversations elsewhere. Thank you. Representative Dorr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Fisher, as I was saying, I agree. We want to keep statutes as we can clean, and there are some rules out there. But in this particular case, with this amendment L007, I think this is a reassurance that we need in this particular piece of legislation. Having ran the black-footed ferret bill last year, which did the reintroduction into the private property ownership lands, a lot of what we were talking about was making sure that this animal, which is on the endangered species list, can be reintroduced to land and not have the problems with other issues the land would have. So you don't have to deal with worrying about when the colony population stuff goes around, and we'll talk more about that later. But in this particular case, what we don't want to have happen is oil and gas opportunities are there. The Safe Harbor Act, while it does cover some language, this really puts into the statute a reassurance, which I think is necessary to make sure that this reintroduction is done right as we further the reintroduction beyond the private lands, and I would ask for a yes vote.
Is there any further discussion on substitute amendment L007? Representative Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And members, and I understand Representative Fisher's hesitation, but if you read the amendment, it makes sure that we don't add any additional layers. It still utilizes the same process we have now, where Parks and Wildlife has their process and their input in permitting and those type of things with regard to oil and gas. What this does is clarifies and makes sure the intent of the bill is not to go beyond just the reintroduction of the ferret. I know Representative Fisher had said he chooses to err not to make things more confusing. I choose to err to make sure that we are very clear, laser light focus clear, Spencer or Representative Swam, that the statute is exactly what we want it to be and what it was intended to be. I would ask for your yes vote.
Is there any further discussion on substitute amendment L007? Representative Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I ask for a yes vote on the amendment. I think the language is clear, but we are dealing with the Endangered Species Act here, and there's plenty of history throughout the country that once we attempt to help in the restoration of an endangered species, we are committing ourselves to a whole visibility and a set of rules that may come into play. All this really does is take this language and enforce the authority, the current rules and the current authority of the OGCC in the state. So it really prevents us from going beyond our current laws and statutes and rules. So I think there's no, I don't see that it extends any of the issues. It merely enforces those we already have in place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Mitch Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Having just seen the amendment, I haven't had time to check with those that I would normally like to, my county commissioners. I believe that there are some local control issues here that I might have concerns about. Also, the safe harbor agreement that comes with this introduction does tend to deal with these issues in a very, very specific, concise way. But the language that particularly bothers me here is on line 6 and 7, shall not require any additional approval or impose a higher standard. I don't know, higher standard compared to what? Many counties do have some very strict land control standards, and so would that negate their existing land control standards with regard to wildlife, with regard to other issues? The two counties that I represent do have very strict local control land use standards regarding wildlife and habitat, and so I would be a little concerned on line 6 and 7 in particular, although I certainly understand this point that, and as Representative Rankin said, we don't want to add extra bureaucracy and red tape, surely, and as Representative Sonnenberg said, we don't want counties doing extra things. My only concern is what is extra and how does that relate to what they're already doing, and I haven't really had time to think beyond that.
Representative Sonnenberg.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your questions, and I'm happy to address the two issues you brought up. Actually, you brought up three. One was a local control issue. This doesn't affect the local control issue at all. What this says is that we cannot create a different standard because we've reintroduced the black-footed ferret. As you know, when we have endangered or threatened species already on land somewhere, it creates a different benchmark in which you have to meet certain requirements to do the things you normally do on that land. What we're saying here with lines 6 and 7, and yeah, 6 and 7 is that we don't add any of those additional requirements, that we continue as if the black-footed ferret wasn't there, that same process. Now, with regard to the safe harbor deals with what happens after you're already there. If you take an incidental kill of a black-footed ferret, that has to do with the Safe Harbor Act, and so you're not held responsible. That actually has nothing to do with this amendment. What this amendment does is deals with the act of applying for and meeting the needs as if the black-footed ferret wasn't there, and having an unintended consequence that now we shut down water projects and we shut down oil and gas exploration when the minerals are severed or owned by somebody else. And quite honestly, members, I think that's the right thing to do. I think that it is our job to make sure that those things, those unintended consequences, aren't invoked, and that's why I would ask for your yes vote on L007.
Is there any further discussion on substitute amendment L007? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of substitute amendment L007, and the division has been called. Again, the question is the adoption of substitute Amendment L007. A division has been requested. All those in the chamber not entitled to vote, please be seated. All those in favor of substitute amendment L007, please stand and remain standing in one place until the count is taken. You may be seated. All those opposed to substitute amendment L007, please stand and remain standing in one place until the count is taken. You may be seated. Substitute amendment L007 is lost. To the committee report, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I renew my motion for L006. I apologize that we couldn't find a compromise here. This was intended to be a compromise with Representative Sonnenberg, and I don't know, I think for most of us, I think this works better to have it express the intent of the legislature rather than put it in statute. I ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion on Amendment L006 to the Agricultural, Livestock, and Natural Resource Committee report? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of L006 to the Agricultural, Livestock, and Natural Resource Committee report. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Amendment L006 passes. Representative Fisher, to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Getting back to the bill now, as amended, we passed a bill last year.
Sorry, Representative Fisher, to the committee report.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm sorry. We need to pass the committee report. So I ask for an aye vote on the committee report. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion on the Agricultural, Livestock, and Natural Resource Committee report? Seeing none, all those in favor of the Agricultural, Livestock, and Natural Resources Committee report, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. The ayes have it. The committee report is passed. Now to the bill, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, last year we passed Senate Bill 169, which was run by Representative Dorr, which allows private landowners to enter into safe harbor agreements with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Colorado Division of Parks and Wildlife to reintroduce black-footed ferrets, which is probably one of the most endangered mammals in North America, on properties that are suitable habitat here in Colorado. Shortly after the passage of Senate Bill 169, I was approached by folks up in Fort Collins who said, well, wait a minute, we would like to reintroduce black-footed ferrets on land that we own. We have over 50,000 acres of publicly owned open space north of Fort Collins that has a suitable number of prairie dogs on it, and it would be ideal habitat for black-footed ferrets. And I informed them that, unfortunately, the way the bill was written last year, it was limited to private landowners. So what this bill does is it allows that political subdivisions of the state and land owned by political subdivisions of the state be allowed to reintroduce black-footed ferrets under the same conditions that private landowners would be able to utilize. Now, this would include only those public lands that are owned by municipalities, county governments, and some special districts. It would not include state public lands or or federal public lands. It was pretty clear in the stakeholder process leading up to Senate Bill 169 that the stakeholders in that would not accept anything that would allow for the reintroduction of black-footed ferrets on state-owned or federally owned land. So this is very narrowly crafted to only include those lands similar to the open space owned by the city of Fort Collins, north of Fort Collins. Now, during the committee hearing, Representative Rankin expressed interest in perhaps limiting it in the scope to just a few political subdivisions taking advantage of this at first to see if there was going to be any unintended consequences. And at the time, I hadn't spoken with the bill proponents about that. And so we didn't adopt an amendment at that time, but I am now, Mr. Chairman, I do move L005 to address Representative Rankin's concern.
Amendment L005 is before us, properly before us, and displayed. Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What this amendment does is it limits to 3 political subdivisions of the state that would be able to reintroduce black-footed ferrets under this bill. But after a 5-year period, that restriction would sunset. So we would be able to see make sure that there weren't any unintended consequences of this taking place for the first 5 years, and then this restriction would be automatically sunsetted. And so I would ask for an aye vote on Amendment L005.
Representative Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Fisher, for acknowledging this discussion in the committee hearing. Although, again, the Environmental Species Act is very popular, and we, the state of Colorado, have a very good history of participating in restoring both habitat and sometimes preventing certain species from being listed. And, you know, in my part of the state right now, the sage grouse debate is hot and heavy. So, you know, this is very much on the minds of a lot of us in the state. But I did feel, you know, last year we had these cute little critter come in. They actually brought a black-footed ferret. I don't know if many of you got to see that. And we voted for putting some of these colonies on private lands. We do have one colony underway down, I believe, west of Pueblo. There are 53 animals were introduced there, but we don't know how well that's going. We haven't. It'll be this fall before we actually take an inventory and find out how many of those animals have survived and how many prairie dogs they've eaten, and et cetera, et cetera. We need to go very carefully when it comes to habitat and restoring endangered species, because we fall into a whole new regime of public scrutiny and rulemaking when it comes to endangered species. So for that reason, I felt like we should go slow. And I really appreciate this amendment. It makes me actually support the bill, because now we can experiment with this, and with this limitation combined with the safe harbor clause that's in the bill, I believe that we have, and with the declaration, I think we have adequate protections and safeguards around our attempts to participate, by the way, with 11 other states in restoring this endangered species. So thank you, Chairman Fisher, or Representative Fisher, for the amendment, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further discussion on Amendment L005? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of Amendment L005. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Amendment L005 passes. Representative Dorr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Fisher, I just have a couple questions about, from what we did last year in private land and making sure that it rolls over to the public land intent. Is there an acreage size requirement that would be followed with this legislation so that one of the issues of the black-footed ferret is they need to have a certain amount of acreage that they cover, or else the prairie dog colony will just run off, and you'll have an issue with the prairie dog colony, not necessarily the black-footed ferret as much, spilling over into land that was the unintended area it was supposed to go. And my second question with it is, while private land has an easy way of border control when it comes to prairie dog populations, there are some issues potentially on the public land using the same type of procedures for border control. Specifically, sometimes it'll be necessary to put up some levels of barrier around with poisons and stuff to make sure that the colony doesn't go into another unintended area of land. Would there be any issues on the public side of public land with using those same type of border control options to make sure that the colonies don't go off into unintended lands?
Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that issue was addressed in the legislative declaration, and it's part of the safe harbor agreement that folks, adjacent landowners who don't want prairie dog colonies to move onto their land can exercise under the safe harbor agreement, can exercise control measures, including lethal control measures, to prevent the spread of prairie dogs. And the habitat requirements for black-footed ferrets are fairly narrow. You need about 1,500 to 3,000 acres of either black-footed or black-tailed or white-tailed prairie dogs to sustain a population of black-footed ferrets. Those on public lands that are owned by a political subdivision of the state, that's there's probably a fairly small number of those of properties that meet that requirement. But the city of Fort Collins in particular has agreements in place with all their adjacent landowners to prevent the spread of prairie dogs onto adjacent properties, and indeed have a buffer around their property boundaries to not allow prairie dogs to even come close to adjacent landowner property without their consent. And I think that most public open space programs in Colorado would have similar good neighbor policies where they try to prevent the spread of animals onto adjacent property. So I think that would be an issue that will be adequately addressed in the implementation by the local political subdivision of the state.
Representative Dorr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Fisher, thank you for answering those questions. And it only brought one other question to mind. Because the Safe Harbor Acts, while there is some details in them, there is some negotiating, if you will, that can go on. Will the political subdivision be responsible for the border control, or would they expect the private landowner to be responsible for their own border control?
Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think, especially in the case of the city of Fort Collins, they have taken responsibility to prevent the control or to prevent the spread of prairie dogs on their property, and so they are the responsible entity. But I think the purpose of the Safe Harbor Agreement is to ensure that the interests of the adjacent landowners are adequately taken into consideration. So I'm reasonably confident that any Safe Harbor Agreement is going to require that the landowner take responsibility for controlling prairie dog populations on their property and taking control measures, including lethal control measures, to prevent the spread off of their property.
Representative Dorr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Fisher, thank you. But there's no requirement in the legislation that the public landowner take those precautions. I mean, it can be part of the safe harbor agreement. The safe harbor agreement, the way I understand it, is make sure that when that prairie dog or when that ferret comes across onto your land, and where something were to happen to the ferret, you aren't held responsible for the death of the endangered species. But I'm not sure if the safe harbor agreement goes as far as to say you, landowner with the ferret on it, have to take the precautions as reasonable as you can to make sure that the ferret does not leave your property onto an adjacent land. Because what happens in a lot of these cases is the prairie dog colony doesn't tend to want to hang out and just get eaten the whole time. So they will move over a little bit and move onto that adjacent land. And so the prevention of it, we're on a private to private land, is obviously a lot simpler than because of restrictions we have under different environmental and stuff regulations for a public entity to take some of those precautions. So I'm just trying to get a sense. I want to support this, but get a sense if the same type of flexibility would be allowed to the public land operations as they are to the private land operations.
Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, Representative Dorr, that there would be no distinction made between a private landowner and an owner of land who is a political subdivision of the state. So the law that you passed last year, I believe, covers both adequately. There would be no exceptions or no special treatment that I'm aware of that would be given deference to a political subdivision of the state as opposed to a public landowner.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the question before us is the passage of House Bill 1267 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. House Bill 1267 passes. Mr. Kohler, I see we have the Mighty Morphin Power Ranger bill coming up. Please read Senate Bill 119.
Senate Bill 119 by Senator Heath, also represents Holinghorse and Del Grosso, concerning decriminalization of certain prohibited practices by persons engaged in lobbying.
Madam Majority Leader, we're looking for you. Are we done? Senate Bill 119.
Oh, it's my bill. And the minority leader's bill. Yes,
Okay. Mr. Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move Senate Bill 119 and the report from the State Veterans Military Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Minority Leader. To the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, the State Veterans Military Affairs Committee, the amendment that was put on leaves in perceived bribery and other loans that a lobbyist might make towards a representative. And we left that in there, so we didn't want to decriminalize those actions. So I urge an aye vote on the committee report.
Is there any further discussion on the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report passes. Madam Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill, we ask for an aye vote, simply provides for a different arrangement for certain offenses that would not rise to the level of a criminal act or a misdemeanor, for a way to provide for justice on those issues if they're violated, and that would relate to misleading a lobbyist or the body in some way. Actually threatening to go after a member in an election if they don't comply with something. And those are the what we would call all those serious, lesser issues. And there is a very good way for an ethics committee to deal with that now and to find wrong relative to that through the ethics committee. So this is a good bill. I ask for a yes vote.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the question before us is the passage of Senate Bill 119. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Senate Bill 119 passes. Mr. Kohler, please read the title of House Bill 1260.
House Bill 1260, Representative Foot, Alster, and Johnson, concerning the creation of 3 mandatory minimum presumptive ranges for defendants convicted of a felony sex offense involving intrusion against a child who is under 12 years of age when the adult defendant is at least 10 years older. There's one of the ranges starting at 10 years as the minimum in the range in connection with creating an indeterminate lifetime sentence with a mandatory minimum presumptive range of 10 to 16 years for a Class 4 felony, a mandatory minimum presumptive range of 18 to 32 years for a Class 3 felony, and a mandatory minimum presumptive range of 24 to 48 years for a Class 2 felony.
You couldn't do that all in one breath? No. Representative Foot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move House Bill 1260 in the committee report.
Thank you. To the committee report. Representative Foot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This committee report, members, was from the committee that makes it explicit that shall this bill pass, it will be named Jessica's Law, and it will be adopting Colorado's version of Jessica's Law. I ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion on the committee report? Representative Szabo, Madam Assistant Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to move
Can you just please move?
L008.
Can you please move it?
Yes, I move L008 and ask it to be displayed. L008, well, L001.
Just one moment, Representative Szabo.
Okay.
The Judiciary Committee amendment, not a State Affairs.
Judiciary? I've never
We'll
went
stand
to
in brief
judiciary.
recess.
There we go.
The committee will come back to order. Amendment L008 is properly before us and displayed. Madam Assistant Majority Leader.
Thank you. I wish I was the Madam Assistant Majority Leader.
Minority Leader.
But since I'm not, and the amendment was printed wrong, how about we move L008, to amend the committee report in the State Veterans Military Affairs Committee. And display.
The amendment is properly before us and displayed. Please proceed, Madam Assistant Minority Leader.
That's a mouthful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the State Affairs Committee, there was an amendment ran at the end of the committee hearing, L001. And what that did is it changed the committee report on House Bill 1260, which gives the children and the families of this state a false sense of security. By simply changing the sentencing structure of our already lax laws on the books and calling it Jessica's Law, which is known for coming down hard on sex offenders with a 25-year mandatory sentence for raping a child. Jessica's Law is a specific law that pays tribute to a beautiful young girl who was beautifully raped and killed by a repeat sex offender. If her predator would have been charged and convicted and sentenced with a 25-year sentence, one of the other times he was caught preying on children, Jessica would be turning 18 years old this year. Her name happens to be Jessica Lunsford, hence Jessica's Law. A 25-year mandatory sentence, Jessica's Law, not only protects children, but now it also protects them long into the future. It will protect them now by getting their terrorist out of their life immediately, keeping them out of their life for a very long time. What happened in the committee report is another political trick like we saw last year on this same issue. But last year, the excuses were the DAs don't like it and our laws are strong enough. That's why the new sentencing structure change made by our Boulder Deputy DA.
Madam Assistant Minority Leader, is this to your amendment?
Yes, to the amendment. This is simply playing politics with our children for a second year in a row. It is another round of smoke and mirrors. Although I agree, we need to do whatever we can to keep these child rapists in jail longer than they are being kept now. I appreciate the efforts that are being made, and I am pleased after everything that happened last year when I brought the issue to light that I could perpetuate some attempt to make a change. I am also saddened, and it is shameful that there are still politics involved when we are dealing with our most vulnerable children by trying to call a sentencing structure change Jessica's Law, when we all know it is not. And I ask for an aye vote on L008 to get rid of the committee report amendment. Thank you.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm interested, Representative Szabo, that you seem to be very focused on the fact that only one particular sentence provision would be Jessica's Law, given the fact that the Jessica's Law people have actually supported House Bill 1260. So obviously they don't think that the 25 to life is required. And I'm also interested to know if you know how many other states have adopted something other than a 25 to life. And I guess I'll not leave that rhetorical. I'll just tell you that over the half of the states that have adopted Jessica's Law have not adopted the 25 to life. In addition to that, Mr. Chair, I'd ask for a title ruling at this point.
Committee will stand in recess. The committee will come back to order. The chair rules that the amendment does not fit under the title. Assistant Minority Leader Szabo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I ask that we just oppose the amendment to the committee report because what Representative Foote, although it is an attempt to keep child rapists in jail longer, it is definitely not Jessica's law.
Assistant Minority Leader Szabo.
Thank you. And Representative Foote, can you please ask me your questions again? You had a couple questions for me. One we just answered. What was the other one? How many states? Oh, you asked me, okay, that the Jessica's Law people agreed with your bill. And you know what? They agree with keeping child rapists in jail longer. Even if it's 1 minute longer, they agree with that. They don't agree that it is Jessica's Law. I had several conversations. They are the ones that put Jessica's Law legislation into statute in Florida where it originated from. What was your other question, Representative Foote?
Representative Foote. Remember, we are to the committee report.
He had questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr.
wanna
Chair.
ask him later?
I'll actually go into just a couple things here and explain what I'm talking about here. First of all, Representative Szabo, I guess you should, when you say that the Jessica's Law people don't support this particular bill, I guess you should, I hope you speak with Mark Lunsford, Mr. Lunsford himself, because after the committee, he called me up to thank me for what we're doing here and running this bill. And so there is support from those that want to see this adopted in Colorado, including Jessica's father himself. Now, one thing that I want to mention regarding other states and how they do Jessica's Law. You know, what I've been hearing, and I guess what I'm hearing also to this amendment or this committee report, is that if it's not 25 to life, then it's not Jessica's Law. I've been hearing that, and I think I'm hearing that from the opposition here today. But when you look at information, and you look at how the other states have adopted it, you'll see that over half of the states that have adopted Jessica's Law do not do a 25 to life provision. If 25 to life was a requirement for Jessica's Law, then Washington would not have Jessica's Law. If 25 to life was a requirement for Jessica's Law, Oregon would not have a Jessica's Law. Neither would New Mexico. Neither would Wyoming. Neither would North or South Dakota. Neither would Nebraska. Neither would Texas. And again, I'm saying if it's 25 to life for a first offense, if that's Jessica's Law, these states don't have Jessica's Law. And I'm just west of the Mississippi at this point. Let's go east of the Mississippi. If 25 to life on a first offense was the only thing that could be Jessica's Law, then Wisconsin would not have Jessica's Law. Then Iowa would not have Jessica's Law. Then Missouri would not have Jessica's Law. Then Alabama would not have Jessica's Law, nor would Mississippi, nor would Georgia, nor would Virginia, nor would Pennsylvania, nor would Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, or Pennsylvania. So it's clear, and when you take a look at what Jessica's Law has been, or how it's been implemented in other states, it's clear that 25 to life is not a mandatory requirement. In fact, most of the states don't do it that way. They do it what works for their state, and we're doing it the way that works for Colorado. That's how the Jessica's Law people would like to see it, and that's how I want to see it as well. If Jessica's Law had to be the same as Florida's law, members, then only Florida would have Jessica's Law. What we're trying to do here is adopt Jessica's Law in a way that works for the state of Colorado.
Assistant Minority Leader Szabo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I received a report from the National Conference of State Legislators. Most of us rely heavily on a lot of the information that comes out of there. And they did an assessment on 37 states that have adopted Jessica's Law and the provision of Jessica's Law. And their finding was not half of the states don't have the 25-year mandatory minimum. They found out that only 9 states don't. And in Connecticut, one of the states that you mentioned, it does have a 25-year mandatory minimum sentence, according to NCSL, I guess, if we want to trust their data. And so that is not true. Some states do, for a repeat offender, they do life mandatory, period. There are several states that do that, that have a higher than 25-year mandatory. And when I'm out talking to the folks in Colorado and I tell them 25 years, they say that's all. They aren't amused that our laws are very lax on that, and they want them to be some of the highest they can be in the country. That's what's good for our state. That's what I'm hearing.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Szabo, what I said was 25 to life. That's different than a 25-year mandatory minimum. There's not many states that do a 25 to life. Less than half of the states do 25 to life. That's what I said, and I was clear about that. Less than half of the states that have adopted Jessica's Law have adopted a 25 to life, which is what I'm hearing you and other opponents think that we should do. Now, what I want to do really quickly is I want to quote a report that was done by the Colorado Criminal and Juvenile Justice Commission. It's a bipartisan commission made up of stakeholders in law enforcement, defense attorneys, judges, and so forth, when they examined Jessica's Law just last fall. And you don't have to take my word for it, because all this information is attached to the CCJJ report. What it says is, quote, other states have adopted some pieces of the Florida statutes, but there is no uniform model that has been adopted wholesale in other jurisdictions. Now, that CCJJ report was approved by Republican and Democratic law enforcement officials and Republican and Democratic legislators. That is what the CCJJ says about Jessica's Law. And take a look at it for yourself. What you'll see is exactly what I've been saying.
Assistant Minority Leader Szabo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, it does say that, but the CCJ report also says that our laws in Colorado are strong enough. So, like Representative Foote says, do take a look at it, because they are not.
Assistant Majority Leader Pabon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I really like about this bill, notwithstanding the comparisons between these other laws all over the state of the Union.
We are to the amendment?
Or
the committee report, sorry.
And the committee report in particular, is that this is really a Colorado committee report. and a Colorado solution to that committee report. So I rise in strong support of this committee report. It's a Colorado committee report. We should vote yes.
Nice save. Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, to a prior bill on a prior day in another state, to the committee report. Seriously, members, I want to congratulate the majority party for finally figuring out something that I wondered if they'd ever get around to some 5 years ago. So congratulations. I wondered if they'd ever get around to figuring out that they could just, and they got at the 11th hour in committee figured it out, oh, let's call it Jessica's Law, and nobody will ever know the difference. Congratulations. I hope I didn't say something in the hallway that was overheard. I hope you arrived there 5 years later on your own. But it strikes me as, with all respect, but nevertheless, I find no other word to describe it other than being a bit disingenuous. And this is, Mr. Chair, to the committee report, because the committee report says that this is like Jessica's Law. Well, Jessica's Law in Florida is 25 years to life mandatory minimum against a victim less than 12 years of age. What the bill does that we seek by this committee report to call Jessica's Law is sets a minimum for one level of felony of a minimum of 10 For the next level of felony, a minimum of 18. And when you finally get to a Class 2 felony, well, then they'll do 24 as a minimum. And there is a range, but those minimums are there, and all of them are less than 25 to life for all of these levels of felony. And so, to come in at the last minute in the committee, Representative Foote, and say, oh, let's call it Jessica's Law now. Well, you could call it, to hearken to a debate I had in Jess the other day, you could call it Curley's Law or Bob's Law, or you could call it anything else, but it'll make it so. It does not make it so. And I have not said this year from in committee or at the well, but you know, if we legislatively call something an orange, then it's an orange, even if it's an apple, which is often disingenuous on legislators' parts. And to say that this is Jessica's Law when it sets up a three-tiered structure with as little as 10 years for what the actual Jessica's Law would prescribe 25 to life is just playing fast and loose with the facts. I can't stop you if you have 33 votes in this House. I can't stop you from being disingenuous legislatively. But I can come to the well and tell the people of Colorado that that is what it is. I can call it what it is, and I can ask for a no vote and ask for a little legislative truth and legislation passing and naming, and not try to take a course that it took you long enough to get to. That's the amazing part to me, frankly. But I still think that Bill O'Reilly might be out your front door. I don't think calling it that's going to make it that. And so I ask for a no vote on the committee report.
Representative McNulty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michael, this is the worst kind of politics. The worst kind of politics.
Seriously, Frank, you're saying that to me?
You should be ashamed of yourself.
Representative McNulty, we are not going to impugn the motives of our members.
Jessica Lunsford was a 10-year-old girl who was brutally raped and murdered. The bill has been passed in her honor across this state, across this country, has been passed in her memory across this country. And you take the politically expedient route, offer up less than half a loaf, and name it Jessica's Law. That is ridiculous. That is horrible. That is offensive. Colleagues, strike this down on principle.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll tell you what's offensive. Coming to the well to talk about Jessica's Law without having all of the facts. Representative Gardner, you said before that this would be disingenuous to call this Jessica's Law. If that's the case, then I guess I should remind you using the facts of what we know of other states. Then Texas does not have Jessica's Law, or at least they're being disingenuous, because Texas only allows it for a pattern of abuse, 2 or more instances in 30 days. That's when their Jessica's Law kicks in. It must be disingenuous for states like Nebraska and Michigan to call it Jessica's Law. It must be disingenuous of states like New Mexico, Nevada, Missouri, among others, to call it Jessica's Law because they only have use of violence. We don't have that in this one. They only have use of violence before it becomes Jessica's Law. It must be disingenuous of New Mexico, New York, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Wyoming, amongst others, to call theirs Jessica's Law because it only applies to repeat offenders, not first-time offenders like we have in House Bill 1260.
It must be disingenuous then that states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Vermont, and Mississippi, among others, call theirs Jessica's Law because they have less than a 25-year mandatory minimum. It must also be disingenuous for states like California, Connecticut, Georgia, and Oregon, among others, to call theirs Jessica's Law because they have a 25-year mandatory minimum, but they don't go up to lifetime, the potential of lifetime indeterminate sentencing like we do, and incidentally like the Florida law does. The bottom line here, members, is that Jessica's Law has been adopted a different way in every single state. This is a way that works for Colorado. And again, I ask for an aye vote on the committee report.
Representative Gardner.
Thank you. Well, Representative Foote, I'm not the keeper of the conscience of all of those other states. I'm not a state legislator there. So I don't know. I do know that when we deal with uniform laws, we struggle mightily about whether or not something can be called an adoption of the uniform law for whatever. And we conscientiously, both as uniform law commissioners and as legislators here, struggle really hard with that question. Because every law varies, every state varies a little bit. I'm not the keeper of the conscience for Texas, Georgia, North Dakota, New Mexico. I'm not a legislator there, Representative Foote, so I'm not going to say whether they did or didn't, and why they did or didn't, or what debate they might have had. I can only speak for here and now and this bill. And this bill varies so much from the intention of Jessica's Law. In fact, I don't think it's truly Jessica's Law unless it requires mandatory GPS monitoring, something I carried about 5 years ago that the majority party voted down. I think that without GPS monitoring, mandatory monitoring during the parole period, I don't think it can be called Jessica's Law. And Colorado would say, oh, yeah, but we do that. Well, we don't do that mandatorily, and we don't do that enough, and we don't do it very well. Another topic for another day. So, Representative Foote, I'm sorry if I've hit a hot button, but I'm not the conscience of all those other states and all those other legislators. I know that here and now, this bill is nowhere close to what Jessica's Law was intended to be, ought to be, and to call it that is legislative dishonesty.
Assistant Majority Leader Pabon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is to the committee report and is to this particular legislative declaration calling this Jessica's Law. Because what we're losing here, members, is the fact that this law is not a prescriptive law that we have to call it Jessica's Law in order to honor the memory and the life of Jessica Lunsford. That's not what the purpose of calling these mandatory minimums is. The purpose is to remember the crime that was committed and to lay out appropriate and specific punishments in accordance with the current regime that we have in the state of Colorado. We don't have the Texas Criminal Code here or these other state criminal codes. We have a Colorado solution that fits into the same framework and rubric of punishments that we want to make sure are appropriate and intentional and punish those who perpetrate this crime. And when we pass this committee report and we call this Jessica's Law, we create that memory and that legacy and that honoring of that young lady who had a lot of potential before her, and that's why we're calling this Jessica's Law. So I don't want to get lost into the intricacies of the criminal code and the differences between mandatory minimums and 25 years to life, because then we lose Jessica. We lose her memory, we lose her legacy, And that's not what this is about. This is about a Colorado solution that addresses this horrific crime against these perpetrators. We need to honor her memory. We need to pass this committee report.
Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Representative Pabon, if it was just about honoring her memory, honoring Jessica's memory, we could pass a resolution. And if that's all Jessica's law was about, we'd call it Jessica's resolution. This is about extending protection to children in Colorado, and doing so based upon a legislative model that was named in memory of Jessica Lunsford, but nevertheless is a legislative model to protect children. And Representative Foote, I can't help it if all those other states don't want to protect children to the level that can be called Jessica's law. But I think we ought to be honest enough that if we're not going to do that, and we're not going to do it at that level, to not try to tell people that that's what we've done. Because that's what's going on here. As my colleague Representative McNulty pointed out, that's what's going on here. This is purely politics. As I said earlier, I'm astounded it took you so long to get there. Maybe there was some, I don't know, maybe there was some hesitance to do that because of the way it looks and the way it sounds and the way it is. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt about that, colleagues, that maybe you didn't do it before today because you just thought it was wrong. If you're willing to make it 25 to life, notwithstanding it doesn't have global positioning system, GPS monitoring for these criminal perpetrators in our communities, fine, then let's do that. And I suspect if you persist in calling it Jessica's law, we will have that debate on the bill. But I ask for a no vote on this committee report.
Is there any further discussion? Yes, Assistant Minority Leader Szabo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to reiterate something. As we're talking about honoring Jessica and whether that is the crux to calling it Jessica's law, or if we need to be very truthful about what we call a bill. 1266 holds its own merit. It doesn't need to take on an inconsistency by calling it something else. Jessica Lunsford was a beautiful girl who was brutally raped. I will say that again. A beautiful girl who was brutally raped over and over. Given cocaine, tied in a closet with speaker wire for 3 days, and then buried alive. Members, I don't know if 25 years mandatory is even enough for something like that, is even enough of a punishment for something like that. But please, let's not take something that's lesser and dilute what Jessica's law is and say that it's Jessica's law. We heard testimony in committee that said we will still be one of the most lenient states in the West with these new sentencing structure changes. Members, I ask that we just tell the public the truth. Let them draw their own conclusions by giving them information that is truthful. Not play politics with our kids. That's shameful. That's shameful to do that for a second year in a row. Let's keep what Jessica's Law truly is, and let's keep what 1260 what it truly is. I ask for a no vote on the committee report.
Is there any further discussion on the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report passes. To the bill, Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we've already had a debate on the committee report. I think it's relevant to the bill as well, but at this point I'm just going to ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion on House Bill 1260? Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, this is going to be, if it passes and unless it gets changed elsewhere, this is going to be Jessica's Law. So let's make it Jessica's Law. Mr. Chair, I move L004 and ask that it be displayed.
L004 has been moved and is properly before us and properly displayed. Please proceed, Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, what this amendment does is take for all three of the mandatory minimum presumption ranges referenced in the title of this bill and gives all three of these felonies the minimum presumptive range of 25 years to life, as Jessica's Law does. If we're going to do Jessica's Law, I don't see any logic and any reason to do what's currently in the bill. What's currently in the bill is as little as 10 years for a Class 4 felony, or as little as 18 for Class 3, or as little as 24 for a Class 2 felony, the highest level that you can have in this bill and for this crime. So you don't even get to 25 years on any of the levels. We had a great debate on the committee report, and everyone seems to be committed to passing Jessica's Law in Colorado, so let's do it. I don't know why Colorado, everybody's talking about the uniqueness of Colorado. I don't know why Colorado's children are so unique that they need less protection than children in Florida. I don't know why Colorado is so unique that our children are less vulnerable, or that our communities are so much more safe by having convicted sex offenders out on the street after 10 years. Don't know why that would be, but if you want to have a unique Colorado solution, I wouldn't call it Jessica's Law, but we've chosen to do that. I think our communities want just as much protection and just as much safety. Our children are just as vulnerable. Unfortunately, the perpetrators in Colorado are not unique to Colorado. They are just as bad, just as malicious, just as treacherous, and our children just as much at risk. I ask for an aye vote.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask for a title ruling on this as well.
The committee will stand in brief recess to discuss whether this amendment fits under the title. The committee will come back to order. The chair rules that the amendment does not fit under the title. Representative McNulty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is within the majority's prerogative to decide what amendments fit under the title and those that do not. It seems as though we're dealing these last 2 years with a different prerogative on what amendments fit underneath the title and those that do not. It was never meant to shield the majority from cumbersome votes, but rather to ensure that the state maintained the single subject rule. That was the intent behind the question of title rulings. With that in mind, Mr. Chairman, I move Amendment L010 and ask that it be displayed on the board.
Thank you, Representative McNulty. The amendment has been moved and is properly before us and properly displayed. Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Amendment L010 preserves Section A of the bill, which starts the mandatory minimum sentencing at 10 years for touching. I am not comfortable with that, but the majority has declined to allow the amendment to be offered that would deal with that issue. This amendment maintains that provision, as much as I don't like that to be the case, and addresses the question of Class 2 and Class 3 felonies. A Class 3 felony here would be forcible rape upon a child. A Class 2 felony would be forcible rape upon a child with a knife. I want any one of you, to describe to me the difference to that child, to that family, to the community, of whether that forcible rape against that child was with or without a knife. You look those parents in the eye. You tell them that it was different. You do that. And then I will trust that you support the bill as it is written. If you can't do that, support this amendment. It makes sure that those criminals, those pedophiles, those rapists, those murderers are locked up for a minimum of 25 years. This is not some mundane case of analyzing criminal law. This is protecting our children. This is protecting our children against rapists and against murderers. We've had conversations on this, and many believe 25 years isn't enough for raping a child. I tend to agree. But 25 years keeps that rapist from harming other children for those 25 years. The family doesn't know the difference between a Class 2 and a Class 3 felony. And frankly, in this case, when we are talking about our children, our law should not recognize the difference either. I ask for an aye vote on L10.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative McNulty, I actually have looked at the parents in the eyes that have had child victims of child rape, because I've prosecuted these cases. I've spent 12 years as a deputy district attorney, and as far as I can tell, out of everyone that's come down to the well so far today, I'm the only one that can say that. So I know what works, I know what we have to talk about, and I know the pain they go through. Mr. Chair, at this point, though, I'm going to ask for another title ruling because of the same objection.
The committee will stand in brief recess to discuss whether the amendment fits under the title. Will the representatives please join me on the side of the chamber for a discussion? The committee will come back to order. The chair rules that the amendment does not fit under the title. Is there any further discussion on House Bill 1260? Seeing none, Representative Nordberg.
Thank you, Representative Salazar. Mr. Chair, I move Amendment L012 and ask that it be displayed.
Amendment L012 has been moved and is properly before us and properly displayed. Please proceed, Representative Nordberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's hope this has better luck than the previous amendments. This amendment would require those convicted under the sex offenses in this bill to have electronic monitoring for the duration of their probation. There's hardly anything in this bill that reminisces the original Jessica law, but I'm proud to say that this amendment does come from that original bill. I think it's important that we need to ensure that our children continue to be protected after the pedophiles are released into our neighborhoods after serving these mandatory minimum sentences, and would ask for a yes vote on this amendment.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I ask for a title ruling.
The committee will stand in a brief recess to discuss whether the amendment fits under the title. Will the representatives please join me at the side of the chamber for a discussion? The committee will come back to order. Representative Nordberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I withdraw Amendment L012.
012 has been withdrawn. Representative Nordberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move Amendment L014.
Yeah, I got it.
L014 has been moved and is properly before us and properly displayed. Please proceed, Representative Nordberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the offenses in this bill, probation is not a consideration, but parole is. So we've changed the language. We've changed probation to parole. I would ask for a yes vote.
Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Nordberg. In fact, this short provision is much like a bill that I brought 5 years ago or so, maybe 6 now, requiring electronic monitoring for those sex offenders that are released from the Department of Corrections. And it is a key and principal part of Jessica's Law. In fact, when I crafted that provision, and I only speak to it as a done fact, when I crafted that provision, Mark Lunsford honored me and the memory of his daughter by coming and testifying on that bill as being a key part of Jessica's Law. We have called this bill Jessica's Law, and because we ought to require GPS monitoring. That was a key portion, because what happened in the case of Jessica Lunsford is that a sex offender, a prior sex offender, abducted her. Someone who had no accountability, could not be watched, was loose in the community, lived nearby. Had there been electronic monitoring, they would have either known that he slipped the monitor, or they would have known where he was. They could have accounted for them. They could have done many, many things. This is an important part of Jessica's Law, and I ask for an aye vote.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will ask for an aye vote on this as well.
Is there any further discussion on Amendment L014? Seeing none, the question before us is the adoption of Amendment L014. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Amendment L014 is passed. To the bill. Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask for an aye vote on House Bill 1260.
Is there any further? Yes, Representative Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, here's my concern. I think we've moved a step in the right direction by adopting this amendment, but we continue to talk about Jessica Lunsford, so let's talk about her case, and let's talk about the history of Cooey, her murderer. Let's talk about the fact that in 1978, he was convicted of a crime that may have not even fit under this provision on whether or not it was actually a form of intrusion. Let's talk about the fact that under that law and now Colorado's current law, he could have been released under best case scenario, the minimum presumptive range for that Class 4 or even Class 3 felony. He would have been out in time to commit the murder and the brutal rape and murder that he committed. So we've adopted now mandatory tracking for a period of time if this offender were to be paroled. But I think they ought to be paroled for life. It ought to be a mandatory life parole. So I would ask the sponsor of this legislation, has that discussion been had, Representative Foote? Representative Foote? Have you had the discussion, Representative Foote, on whether or not a mandatory parole sentence should be required on these sentences? If you could answer that question, I'd appreciate it.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, Representative Wright, as I'm sure you know by reading the bill, these are indeterminate life sentences. And so these defendants can be in prison for the rest of their natural life. And that's actually how we have it now in Colorado law. But what this would do is raise the floor and the mandatory minimum. But the bottom line here is that they're not getting out unless the folks at the Department of Corrections think that it's wise for community safety. And they could be in there for up to their life. And in fact, many of them, since the Indeterminate Life Act was passed in the late 1990s, have been there for the entire time. They'll get 2 to life or 3 to life or 4 to life. They could be out in 4. They're still in. And that's because they haven't successfully completed treatment, or they're still a risk to the community, or whatever the provision is. So right now we have indeterminate life sentence for the Department of Corrections. They're in there. There's not a mandatory parole date. So they don't have to be paroled. And in fact, many of them aren't. If they're still a danger to the community, they won't even be paroled, so we don't have to worry about a parole period at that point.
Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Foote, I want to thank you for supporting the last amendment on electronic monitoring. I actually believe that the electronic monitoring piece of this and the mandatory electronic monitoring is a more crucial piece of Jessica's law than the minimums. Because you create an indeterminate life sentence and you create the potential for lifetime monitoring, an indeterminate life sentencing. So these paroles, in many, if not most cases, are going to be life parole, and these sex offenders are going to be monitored under this bill. Now, I caution you, Representative Foote, that when I carried this bill 5 years ago, the price tag was hefty. And for some reason, my Democratic colleagues, I was just a mere freshman in the minority, my Democratic colleagues said that this was a very important bill. It was really important, and they really got the public safety stuff, but there just wasn't enough money. Well, let's find the money. I will help you find the money. Let's do that for electronic monitoring. And if we do, and if we can, the fact that it's called Jessica's Law, in my view, would no longer be legislative dishonesty. It would be truth, because electronic monitoring is what is so critical to this bill. When it's not in so many cases how long they stay, though they should stay long. It is that they are not required to be monitored in every case. I ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the question before us is yes, Assistant Minority Leader Szabo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree with Representative Gardner that the electronic monitoring piece is definitely a provision that would help keep other children safe in their communities. Children that came after the ones that their particular rapist got one of those mandatory minimums. Part of what Jessica's Law does is it does sentence the child rapist to 25 years. And the need for that is to protect the child for other reasons. So this child that could have been raped over and over from the same person would be free from that torment. But it also protects them from having to go to parole hearings year after year because their rapist got the minimum sentence. So what the monitoring after they get out would keep future children more safe. Unless, of course, they cut it off and took off, which we've seen many times this year. A perpetrator's cutting off their ankle bracelet and then nobody has a clue where they are. So I agree with Representative Gardner, but I don't think that just putting ankle bracelets on there makes it the complete Jessica's Law. Because that would protect the child that had been violated over and over. The long sentence. And then, if they happen to get out, it would protect future children. Colleagues, that's what I think it's our duty to do. That's what I think our oath of office asked us to do. To protect those children from their enemies, foreign and domestic.
Is there any further discussion? Yes, Representative Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of my concerns, and again I addressed it with the sponsor in looking at the Lunsford case itself, is that there is a potential. Now, I'm not saying that I don't have faith in our justice system, but there certainly is a potential for an offender to slip through the cracks of our justice system, end up back out on the street, and reoffend. I appreciate Representative Nordberg's amendment to address the tracking portion. However, there isn't a determinate parole sentence. So there is an opportunity that that individual might be on parole for 5 years, 2 years, 6 months maybe, and then be able to go out and reoffend without being tracked in any way, out there on their own, preying on our children in our communities once again. So, Mr. Chair and members, I move Amendment L015 and ask that it be displayed on the screen.
Amendment L015 has been properly moved and is properly before us and displayed. Please proceed, Representative Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, members, L015 will require, as does Florida in the original Jessica's Law, that the offender be placed after serving their sentence on mandatory lifetime parole. This is an extra safety measure, in my opinion, to protect our kids. Why would we not require that this individual who has been convicted of such a heinous offense against our children, against our society, be tracked for our safety so we know where they are at? I would request members an aye vote on L015.
Is there any further discussion on Amendment L015? Mr. Assistant Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I'm just trying to square this with the previous amendment that was just put on the bill that says that the electronic monitoring shall follow through with the sentence of parole. And then this essentially says that if the sex offender is released on parole, contemplates that the parole board so not discharge the sex offender from parole. But isn't there a condition precedent to that that says the parole board actually would have to release them from parole? So I'm trying to think through the logistics of this and how this works, particularly when we have a completed sentence in the first, this previous amendment, and now we're saying the sex offender sentenced to incarceration shall not be discharged for the remainder of the sex offender's natural life. Can you help me understand that?
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask for a title ruling.
The committee will stand in a brief recess to discuss whether the amendment fits under a title. Will the representatives please join me on the side of the chamber for discussion? The committee will come back to order. The chair rules that this is a settled question. Is there any further discussion on House Bill 1260? Seeing none, the question before us is the passage of House Bill 1260 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. House Bill 1260 as amended passes. Mr. Kohler. Please read the title. Yes, Madam Majority Leader. I was going slow enough.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the committee rise and report.
Shockingly, you screwed up in the drafting.
I'm trying to find it. The motion has been made to rise and report. Are there any objections? Seeing none, the committee will rise and report.
The House will come back to order. Mr. Kohler, please read the report of the committee of the whole.
Mr. Speaker, Committee of the Whole executive report is under consideration. The following attached bills being second reading thereof makes following recommendations thereon. House Bills 1260 amended, 1267 amended, passed on second reading, order of gross placed on the counter for third and final passage. Senate Bill 119 amended, passed on second reading, and order revised to place on the counter for third and final passage.
Representative Salazar. Thank you, everyone, for helping them. You've heard the motion. There are amendments at the desk. Mr. Kohler, please read the Sonnenberg amendment to the report of the Committee of the Whole.
Representative Sonnenberg moved to amend the report of the Committee of the Whole to reverse the action taken by the committee in not adopting the following Sonnenberg Amendment L007 to House Bill 1267 to show that said amendment passed and that the following Fisher Amendment L006 to House Bill 1267 lost and that House Bill 1267 as amended passed.
Representative Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the Sonnenberg Amendment to the Committee of the Whole.
To the amendment, Representative Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. As you know, legislative declaration does not end up in the statutes. That's why we need to be clear on what this does. That's why in committee, when the questions were asked, will this affect oil and gas production? Will this affect water projects? They said it is not our intent to restrict those operations. So let's just be clear. Let's put it in the bill and make sure that it's clear. Not trying to stop anything. The truth is, you put that amendment in the bill, you get a large portion of this side of the aisle. I'd ask for your yes vote on this amendment.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I ask for no vote on the amendment, the Sonnenberg amendment. I think we took care of this by putting the same language into a legislative declaration, which is really pretty much all this does anyway, is state the intent of the legislation. You know, I think the language is somewhat imprecise here, that it talks about a higher standard. Higher standard of what? The standards are not defined. It also talks about a delay in approval. Approval of what? Right now, there is no real approval involved. It's just simply the safe harbor agreement, which is agreed to by all the parties, including the surrounding landowners. And so I don't know. I just think that it's not necessary. I think we compromised by putting the same language in the legislative declaration, and I just ask for a no vote on the Sonnenberg amendment.
Representative Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you exactly what those two mean. We currently have certain standards on which this process goes through. What this amendment says is we cannot increase those standards solely because of the reintroduction. That's all this says. Very simple. We currently have regulations with regard to the oil and gas, with regard to water. Those are in place now. All this says is we cannot increase those simply because of the reintroduction. That's all. That's what the city of Fort Collins said. That's not their intent. The standards are very clear. The rules we talk about on a regular basis in this chamber. I would ask you to leave those rules the same and not have it changed. If truly this bill is about reintroducing the black-footed ferret and not causing all sorts of other unintended consequences, then let's clean up those unintended consequences. I ask for a yes vote.
Seeing no further discussion, the question before the House is the adoption of the Sonnenberg Amendment to the report of the Committee of the Whole. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine and members proceed to vote. Close the machine. With 30 aye votes, 35 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, the Sonnenberg Amendment to the report of the Committee of the Whole is lost. Mr. Kohler, please read the Szabo Amendment to the report of the Committee of the Whole.
Representative Szabo moved to amend the report of the Committee of the Whole to reverse the action taken by the committee in adopting the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee report to House Bill 1260 dated March 3, 2014 to show that said report lost and that House Bill 1260 as amended passed.
Madam Assistant Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I ask for an aye vote on the Committee of the Whole to
Could you move the amendment?
I move, sorry. I move the Szabo Amendment to the Committee of the Whole. And I ask for an aye vote to reverse the action taken on the committee report in the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. Colleagues, let's be clear. Let's be clear on what we are voting on. Is this smoke and mirrors? We can call it bait and switch, whatever you want to call it. House Bill 1260 is not Jessica's Law. Although it is a step in the right direction, it is still not Jessica's Law. What happened in the committee report is just more political tricks like we saw last year. It is Jessica's Law light. It is our obligation, members, to come down hard on the people who would do these evil things to our children. The people outside of this dome demand that out of us. Although I'm bewildered why putting a 25-year to life provision in statute causes so much contention, I'm baffled. The people outside of this building are baffled. In fact, they want it to be longer. They don't think it's enough. We're getting caught up in the politics of this business, and in fact, it's harming our children. Our kids deserve the ultimate protection we can give them. Let's not give them something light. Let's not be some of the most lenient laws, one of the states that have some of the most lenient laws in the West. Let's be the leader. Let's be the maverick. Colorado always has been. We pride ourselves on that. So I would ask that we call 1260 a sentencing structure change, just like it is. Not Jessica's Law, something that it isn't. Thank you.
Representative McNulty.
Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, I think that one can in good conscience vote for this bill. It does create mandatory minimums where there are none. Representative Nordberg's amendment, I think, improved it, and if Representative Wright's amendment can be worked out, then the bill is immensely improved. So on the substance, while I would defer to locking rapists and murderers up for a longer period of time, it is better than what we have now. What I will not do and what I cannot do is support Representative Foote's amendment, support the committee report. To amend the bill in committee to call it Jessica's Law is offensive. That tells me that the bill was not drafted in its formation as being one of these iterations that other states have passed, whether that be Texas or Georgia. That tells me that the amendment was after the fact. The thought was not there in the drafting of the bill. And so you might say it is only a name. Why does that matter? We are not here to question motives, and I won't. But on the committee report and on this amendment, the motivation to draft Jessica's Law was not there at the outset. How do we know that? Because the sponsor of the bill had to amend that piece in. And so what is in a name? To the family, to the memory of the 10-year-old girl who was raped and murdered, buried alive. It matters. To me, the report, the committee report, and Representative Foote's amendment is simply nothing more than a trashy political stunt, and I ask for an aye vote on Representative Szabo's amendment to strike down the committee report.
Representative Foote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple things. First, I had a chance to speak with Mr. Lunsford more than once, actually. The first time I spoke with him was last year when he had traveled out here from Florida. And I went up and spoke with him in the hall, and I spoke with him about Jessica's Law, and I asked him to stick it out, keep working, because that's what I wanted to do as well. That was last spring that I did that, and have been working on a Jessica's Law since then. And as a matter of fact, spoken with Mr. Lunsford, Jessica's father, a couple of times on the phone since then. He thanked me for the efforts that I put forth on this bill. One thing that I guess baffles me about what we just heard is how some, including the opponents, or at least the folks that are running this amendment to the COW, think that we have to adopt one particular state's form of Jessica's Law in order to call it Jessica's Law. Why is it that Florida's version of Jessica's Law is the one that we have to have? Why not adopt Nebraska's version of Jessica's Law, or Maine, or Vermont, or Washington, or Indiana, or Illinois, or Alabama? I could go on and on and on. Why does it have to be Florida? Why does it have to be that one? That's what baffles me. What we're doing in House Bill 1260 is we're implementing Jessica's Law in Colorado in a way that works for Colorado. When we're crafting criminal statutes, and particularly sex offender criminal statutes, which are complex to begin with, that are hard to work with to begin with, we have to be thoughtful about what we're doing. We shouldn't just cut and paste another state's statute like Florida's or any other states and just drop it into ours and expect that it's going to work. We need to do what's right for Colorado. And that's exactly what House Bill 1260 does. It adopts Colorado's Jessica's Law in a way that makes sense for Colorado, so I ask for a no on this amendment.
Seeing no further discussion, the question for the House is the adoption of the Szabo amendment to the report of the committee as a whole. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine and members proceed to vote. Close the machine. With 29 aye votes, 36 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, the Szabo amendment to the report of the committee is lost. There are no more amendments at the desk. Mr. Kohler, please open the machine and members proceed to vote on adoption of the report of the committee as a whole. Representatives Gardner and Murray. Close the machine. With 65 aye votes, 0 no votes, 0 excused, and 0 absent, the report of the committee is adopted. Members, afternoon committees will start at 2 p.m. today, so we'll give you enough time for those who haven't had lunch to get lunch. Announcements and introductions. Representative Labuda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I've served here for 8 years, and all 8 years I've served on the legislative oversight for the continuing examination of the treatment of persons with mental illness who are involved in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. It's a very long title, but it's about the mentally ill who are in our Department of Corrections and in our jails. They're having their general meeting this Thursday and Friday at noon. Those of you who are on the Oversight Committee, this is a reminder that we will be meeting at 1:30 in room 112 to talk about appointments and the activities that the task force has undertaken over the past year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Duran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Joint Budget Committee is going to resume at 1:30 p.m. We have a lot of work to do today.
Representative Singer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and just a special welcome to the people from Youth Action Day, including the students from St. Vrain Valley School District up there in the gallery. Thanks for being here.
Representative Ryden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee, I want to remind you once again that we are not meeting this afternoon and that we have laid over House Bill 1303 to March 31st. Thank you.
Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the House Agriculture, Livestock, and Natural Resources Committee will have one bill by V. Hill, Senate Bill 17 at 2 o'clock this afternoon down in the committee room. And then I also wanted to bring your attention to not just the Ag Committee members, but also Transportation and Energy and others who might be interested in this. On Wednesday morning, the joint Ag Committees from the Senate and the House will be hearing a presentation from the Denver Metro Chamber and Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation. And they're presenting their annual Resource Rich Colorado study, which is a study and a kind of a survey of Colorado's energy resources, including renewables and fossil fuels and other types of energy. So since in the House we're not really the committee of reference for energy issues necessarily, but in the Senate they are, we're having that in the Ag Committee. So I just wanted to make sure that the members of the Transportation and Energy Committee are invited to that presentation as well. That's 7:30 on Wednesday the 19th.
Any further announcements or introductions? Seeing none, given it's almost 1 o'clock, the House will stand in recess, a brief recess probably. Committees again will start at 2 p.m. We'll see you guys back here on the floor at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.